Case 1. The Union Lake Betrayal, Union, South Carolina, 1994. Before the date of October 25th was etched into the national consciousness, Union was the quintessential American mill town. It was a place where the textile industry had built the economy, and faith had built the community. It was a town of Friday night football, front porch conversations, and an unshakable belief that neighbors looked out for one another. But on a cool autumn night, a hysterical young mother ran to a stranger's door on Monarch Highway, screaming a story that would shatter that innocence forever. Susan Smith was 23 years old. She was a mother of 2 beautiful boys, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex. To the cameras that would soon descend on the town, she looked like a broken woman. She claimed that, while she was stopped at a red light, a man, armed with a gun, had jumped into her burgundy 1990 Mazda Protégé. She said he forced her out of the car but drove off with her baby still strapped in the back seat. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The image of 2 helpless children being kidnapped by a gunman struck a nerve across the entire country. Union, South Carolina, became the center of the universe. The FBI arrived. The National Guard was on standby. Yellow ribbons were tied around every oak tree in the county. People who had never met Susan Smith prayed for her, cried for her, and searched the woods for her sons. For 9 days, Susan Smith played the role of the grieving victim on national television. She sat next to her estranged husband, David Smith, pleading through tears for the safe return of her little angels. She looked into the lens of the camera and said, "I just want to hold them again." The nation wept with her, but the investigators on the ground were seeing cracks in the performance. Sheriff Howard Wells was a seasoned lawman, and something about Susan's story didn't sit right. The traffic light she claimed to be stopped at was triggered by sensors it wouldn't turn red unless a car was waiting. And there were no other cars around at that time of night. Her description of the carjacker was vague, relying on racial stereotypes that raised red flags. And then there was her demeanor. When the cameras were off, she seemed too composed, too calculated. The investigation pivoted from a manhunt to a psychological dissection of Susan Smith. Detectives dug into her personal life and found a mess of tangled relationships and rejection. Susan had been having an affair with a wealthy local man named Tom Findlay. Just days before the carjacking, Tom had sent Susan a letter breaking off the relationship. In that letter, he wrote the words that would seal the fate of 2 innocent boys. He told her that he wasn't ready for a family. He said that her children were baggage that he couldn't handle. Susan Smith didn't lose her children to a gunman. She sacrificed them for a boyfriend. On the 3rd of November 1994, the facade crumbled. Under intense questioning, Susan Smith confessed. There was no carjacker. There was no gun. She told Sheriff Wells the horrific truth. On the night of October 25th, she had driven her 2 boys to John D. Long Lake. She wasn't taking them for a ride to soothe them to sleep. She was taking them to their grave. She parked the burgundy Mazda at the top of the boat ramp. The lake was dark, the water black and still. Michael and Alex were strapped into their car seats, likely asleep or looking at their mother with total trust. Susan got out of the car. She stood by the window. She reached in and released the parking brake. The car began to roll. Susan stood on the ramp and watched as the vehicle, carrying the 2 lives she had created, slowly into the water. The taillights submerged. The trunk went under. And then, silence. And then, she turned around, ran to a nearby house, and started the performance of a lifetime. The revelation hit the town of Union like a physical blow. The sympathy turned to a rage so pure it felt like it could burn the courthouse down. The divers went into John D. Long Lake and pulled the Mazda from the muck. Inside, they found the bodies of Michael and Alex, still strapped in. The trial in 1995 was a circus. The prosecution sought the death penalty. They argued that this was the ultimate act of selfishness, a Medea-like betrayal where a mother chose a lover over her own flesh and blood. The defense tried to paint Susan as a victim of a troubled past, of abuse, of depression. They argued and had planned to die with them, but chicken out at the last second. But the jury saw the letter from Tom Findlay. They saw the motive. She wanted a clean slate, to date a rich man, in a decision that shocked many who wanted to see her executed. The jury returned a verdict of guilty, but recommended a life sentence. Susan Smith was sentenced to life in prison. For 30 years, she has sat in the Leith Correctional Institution. But the story didn't end in 1995. The justice of the sentence was that, under the laws of the time, she was eligible for parole after 30 years. That clock ran out in November 2024. Just recently, Susan Smith, now a middle-aged woman, faced a parole board. She asked for freedom. She claimed she was rehabilitated. But the state of South Carolina had not forgotten. David Smith, the father of the boys, stood before the board and reminded them of what she did. He reminded them of the 9 days of lies. He reminded them of the terror Michael and Alex must have felt as the parole board denied her release. Susan Smith remains behind bars. She will likely die there. The mother of the year who fooled a nation is now just inmate #200025. She will never see the outside of a prison fence. She will never walk by a lake without guards. She is a living ghost haunting a cell. While the memory of Michael and Alex remains frozen in time, two beautiful boys who deserved a mother, not a monster. Case 2. The Salt Poisoner. Spartanburg County, South Carolina. July 2016. The foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains provide a scenic backdrop to Spartanburg, a community that prides itself on family values and Southern tradition. But in a modest home in the Fingerville area, a tragedy was unfolding that was so bizarre, so medically specific, and so cruel that it baffled even the most experienced pediatricians. Peyton Martines was 17 months old. She was a twin, a bright-eyed little girl who had fought for her life since the day she was born prematurely. She was a survivor. But she was living in a house where her health was not a priority. It was a tool. Her mother, 3-year-old Kimberly Martines, was a woman who craved attention like a drug. And she discovered that the quickest way to get that fix from her estranged husband, from her family, from Facebook, was through the suffering of her child. The descent into madness began quietly. Peyton was failing to thrive. She was small, lethargic, and constantly sick. Doctors were puzzled. But the truth wasn't a rare genetic disorder. It was in the kitchen cabinet. On the 31st of July, 2016, Kimberly Martines called 911. She was screaming that her baby was having seizures. When paramedics arrived, they found Peyton in a state of acute distress. Her tiny body was convulsing. She was burning up with a fever. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors immediately ran a battery of tests. When the blood work came back, the medical team at Spartanburg Regional Medical Center stared at the results in disbelief. Peyton's sodium levels were off the charts. The normal range for sodium in a human body is between 135 and 145 milliequivalents per liter. Peyton's level was hypernatremic to a degree that is almost never seen naturally. She was dying of acute. Doctors knew this couldn't be an accident. A baby doesn't accidentally eat a amount of salt. It tastes terrible. Their gag reflex would reject it. Police were called to the hospital. Detectives interviewed Kimberly. At first, she played the confused mother. But as the pressure mounted, and the medical evidence pointed clearly to an external cause, her story shifted. She admitted to investigators that she had fed Peyton a teaspoon of salt. Why? To get her husband back into her life. Kimberly believed that if the baby was sick, Her estranged husband, Peyton's father, would have to come home. He would have to comfort her. He would have to pay attention to her. She was using her daughter's body as a pawn in a twisted game of marital manipulation. But the doctors knew a teaspoon wasn't enough to cause this level of devastation. The amount of salt in Peyton's system was massive. Prosecutors later estimated she had been force-fed at least a tablespoon, likely much more, of pure table salt. It was a massive overdose for a 17-month-old infant. It was the equivalent of forcing an adult to drink quart after quart of ocean water. Peyton fought hard. She was placed on life support. For days, machines breathed for her, but the damage was catastrophic. On the 3rd of August 2016, at 1:15 p.m., Peyton Martines was removed from life support. She died in the arms of the medical staff who had tried so hard to save her. Kimberly Martines was arrested and homicide by child. The investigation revealed a pattern of medical abuse. Kimberly had a history of seeking attention through her children's ailments. But this time, she had gone too far. She had researched soy. She knew what she was doing. She knew it would make Peyton sick enough to require a hospital visit, which meant attention for Kimberly. She just didn't care if it killed her. The community was horrified. The idea of a mother forcing salt just to get a text message from an ex-husband was a level of narcissism that defied logic. In 2018, Kimberly Martines stood trial. Faced with the overwhelming medical evidence and her own confession to the motive, she pleaded guilty. The judge sentenced her to 30 years in prison. In South Carolina, home abuse is a serious felony. Kimberly Martines will spend the next 3 decades in the Leith Correctional Institution. She entered as a young woman in her 20s. She will leave, if she survives, as a woman in her 50s. She traded her daughter's life for a moment of attention, and now she has the attention of the entire state, staring at her in disgust. Peyton Martines is gone. Her twin sister survived and was removed from the home. Kimberly Martines sits in a cell, a salt poisoner, whose name is now synonymous with the ultimate betrayal of maternal instinct. She wanted her husband to look at her. Now, the whole world is looking, and they see nothing but a monster. Case 3. The River Orangeburg, South Carolina, August 2010. The North Edisto River is a blackwater river, winding slowly through the cypress swamps and rural roads of Orangeburg County. In the humid heat of late summer, the water is dark, murky, and full of secrets. It is a place where locals go to fish or cool off. But on the morning of the 16th of August 2010, it became the stage for a crime so calculated it rivaled the infamy of Susan Smith. Shaquan Dooley was 29 years old. She was an unemployed mother of 3, living in a cramped house with her own mother and sister. The tension in that home was a physical weight. Arguments about money, about parenting, and about Shaquan's lack of independence were a daily occurrence. But on a Sunday night, the pressure cooker finally exploded. After a particularly vicious fight with her mother, Shaquan decided she was done. She wanted out. She wanted to be free of the burden. But her definition of freedom required a sacrifice. In the pre-dawn darkness of Monday morning, a call came into the highway patrol. A hysterical woman at the Shillingsbridge Road boat landing claimed she had run off the road. She said her car had plunged into the river, and her 2 baby boys, 2-year-old Devian and 18-month-old Javan, were still strapped inside, sinking into the black water. Emergency crews rushed to the scene. It looked like a tragic accident. Divers plunged into the murky depths, fighting the current to reach the submerged Chrysler sedan. They pulled the 2 little boys from the vehicle. The first responders, hardened men and women, were devastated. They thought they were witnessing a mother's worst nightmare, but the physical evidence was whispering a different story. Highway Patrol accident reconstructionists looked at the road. There were no skid marks. There was no sign of braking. There was no torn-up grass, indicating a loss of control. The car hadn't crashed into the river. It had been steered there. And then came the autopsy results from the coroner. This was the smoking gun. But their lungs were dry. Davine and Javan hadn't drowned. They were dead long before the car ever touched the water. Under intense questioning, Shaquan Dooley's story collapsed. The grieving mother mask fell away to reveal a cold-blooded killer who had treated her children like trash to be discarded. She confessed to the true timeline of horror. She hadn't gone to the river immediately. After the fight with her mother, she had driven the boys to a roadside motel in Orangeburg. She checked in, took them into the room, and closed the door. In the quiet of that motel room, while the rest of the world slept, Shaquan Dooley murdered children with her bare hands. Once they were dead, she didn't call the police. She didn't call a priest. She cleaned up the room. She dressed the bodies. She carried them out to the car and strapped them into their car seats, buckling the belts over their lifeless chests. She drove them to the boat landing, put the car in gear, and watched it roll into the river. She wanted the sympathy of a tragic accident. She wanted the world to pity her. Instead, she got the world's hatred. The revelation that she had suffered them before staging the crash was the detail that turned the stomach of the entire state. It showed a level of premeditation that was different. She had time to think. She had time to stop between the first murder and the second, but she didn't. In 2012, Shaquan Dooley stood before a judge in Orangeburg County. Her defense attorney argued that she was depressed, that she felt like a failure, that she snapped. But the prosecution pointed to the drive to the motel, the check-in, the cleanup. That isn't snapping. That is planning. Shaquan Dooley pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder to avoid the death penalty. The judge sentenced her to 35 years in prison. Because of the nature of the crime, she must serve every single day of that sentence. She will be in her mid-60 seconds before she is even considered for release. She sits today in the Leith Correctional Institution, the same prison that houses Susan Smith, 2 women, 2 cars, 2 lakes, and 4 dead sons. Shaquan Dooley tried to wash her hands of her children in the Edisto River. Instead, the river gave them back, and their silence spoke louder than her lies ever could. Case 4. The Aiken Murder. Aiken, South Carolina. May 2011. Aiken is a city known for its winter colony, a place where the wealthy thoroughbred families of the North brought their horses to escape the cold. It is a land of manicured polo fields, whispering pines, and old money. But just miles away from the estates and the equestrian tracks lies a different reality. Neighborhoods struggling with poverty, where the silence of the night is often broken by blue lights. In a modest apartment on Rushton Road, 18-month-old Jamir Green lived a life far removed from the glamour of horse country. He was a toddler, just learning to navigate the world, a boy with big eyes and a trusting heart. But the person he trusted most, his 23-year-old mother Zinzi Clemens, was a ticking time bomb of rage. Zinzi Clemens wasn't the type of mother who quietly struggled. She was volatile. Neighbors later spoke of yelling, of a short temper that flared up over the smallest infractions. But no one knew that inside the walls of that apartment, the end of Jamir's short life came on the 25th of May 2011. The 911 call Zinzi placed was a performance of panic. She told the operator that her son was choking. She claimed he had been eating a Cheeto, a simple, everyday snack, and had suddenly started gasping for air. She was screaming for help, playing the role of the terrified mother to perfection. Paramedics arrived and found the child unresponsive. They worked frantically to clear his airway, expecting to find an obstruction. They found nothing. There was no Cheeto. There was no food lodged in his throat. But as they loaded him into the ambulance and raced toward Aiken Regional Medical Centers, they noticed something else. Jamar's stomach was distended. It was hard to the touch, and bruises were beginning to bloom on his skin like dark flowers. Jameer Green was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. The doctors knew immediately that this wasn't a choking incident. A piece of puffed corn doesn't cause massive internal trauma. The autopsy conducted the next day revealed a level of violence that shocked the coroner. Jameer hadn't choked. He had been beaten to death. The medical examiner found that the 18-month-old had suffered a liver. His ribs were fractured. The force required to cause these injuries was comparable to being kicked by a horse or thrown from a moving vehicle. It was a savage, focused assault. Zinzi Clemens hadn't just hit him, she had stabbed him. When police detectives confronted Zinzi with the autopsy results, the choking story evaporated. She tried to pivot. She claimed she had been playing with him. She claimed she might have played too rough. She tried to minimize the massacre she had committed in her own living room. But the investigation uncovered a pattern. This wasn't the first time Jameer had been hurt. He had old fractures, healing injuries that told the story of a child who lived in constant fear. Zinzi had beaten him because he wouldn't stop crying. She had beaten him because he wouldn't potty train fast enough. She had beaten him because he was an inconvenience to her life. On that final day, she had likely punched or stomped on his stomach in a fit of rage, rupturing his liver. And then, as he lay dying, she concocted the lie about the snack to cover her tracks. The trial in 2012 was brief but brutal. The prosecution laid out the medical evidence. They showed the jury the photos of the battered baby. They played the 911 call, contrasting her fake hysteria with the cold reality of the autopsy report. The judge, Circuit Court Judge Doyet A., early 3, was visibly moved by the cruelty of the case. He looked at Zinzi Clemens, a woman who showed little emotion for the life she had snuffed out. When the verdict of guilty of homicide by child abuse returned, the judge didn't hesitate. He sentenced Zinzi Clemens to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In South Carolina, life means life. There is no board of reviewers who will hear her case in 20 years. There is no second chance. Zinzi Clemens walked out of that courtroom and into a cage where she will remain until she dies. She is a woman who beat a toddler to death for being a toddler. Jameer Green is buried in a small grave in Aiken County. He never got to grow up. He never got to see a horse race. He never got to go to school. His life was stolen by the one person whose only job was to protect it. But the state of South Carolina ensured that his killer paid the ultimate price, her freedom, forever. Case 5. The Black Widow of York. York County, South Carolina, February 2005. Just south of the North Carolina border, York County is a rapidly growing patchwork of suburban sprawl and rural charm. It's a place where many commute to Charlotte for work, returning home to the quiet cul-de-sacs and wooded lots of the Palmetto State. Lee Wagner was one of those men who built his life around that rhythm. He was a hard-working father, a man who loved his children, and a husband who believed his marriage to Crystal Wagner was solid. To the neighbors, they were the picture of stability. Crystal was a mother, a wife, a woman who seemed to have it all. But Crystal Wagner was living a double life. Beneath the veneer of the suburban housewife was a woman consumed by a toxic cocktail of lust and greed. She didn't just want out of her marriage. She wanted a payout, and she wanted a new life with her lover, a man named Shane Lovin. In her twisted calculus, divorce was too expensive. It was too messy. Murder, she decided, was the cleaner option. The conspiracy to end Lee Wagner's life was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a digital assassination, plotted out in emails and chat rooms over months. Crystal and Shane Lovin fed each other's darkness. They referred to Lee not as a husband or a father, but as the beast, an obstacle that needed to be removed so they could live out their twisted fantasy. The execution took place on the weekend of the 20th of February 2005. Lee Wagner was found dead in his own home. The scene was brutal. He had been shot multiple times. It looked, at first glance, like a robbery gone wrong or a home invasion. The sanctity of the home had been violated, and a father lay dead on the floor. When police arrived, Crystal Wagner played the part she had rehearsed. She was the devastated widow. She cried. She held her children. She asked who could have done such a terrible thing to such a good man. But York County detectives are not easily swayed by tears. As they began to peel back the layers of the Wagner marriage, they found the rot immediately. They discovered the affair with Shane Lovin. An affair is a motive, but it's not proof of murder. However, in 2005, people were still careless with their digital footprints. Investigators seized the computers. What they found was a roadmap to murder. The emails between Crystal and Shane were chilling. They detailed the plan. They discussed the timing. They talked about how much happier they would be once the beast was gone. Crystal wasn't a passive participant. She was the architect. She provided the intelligence. She let Shane know when Lee would be vulnerable. She manipulated her lover into becoming her hitman. The investigation revealed that on the night of the murder, while Crystal was conveniently away to establish an alibi, Shane Lovin entered the home. He ambushed Lee Wagner. He shot him in cold blood, ending the life of a man who had no idea that his wife had signed his death warrant. When the police arrested Crystal Wagner, the community was stunned. The mother, who had sat in the front row at the funeral, accepting condolences, was the one who had orchestrated the funeral. The legal battle was fierce. Crystal tried to turn on Shane, and Shane turned on Crystal. But the emails didn't lie. They showed a meeting of the minds, a contract between two lovers to kill a third person. In 2006, the case went to court. The prosecution painted Crystal as a classic Black Widow, a woman who uses men, drains them, and then disposes of them. They argued that she wanted the life insurance money to start her new life with Lovin. Lee was worth more to her dead than alive. The jury saw through the manipulation. They saw a woman who had looked her husband in the eye, kissed him goodbye, and known he would be dead by sunset. Crystal Wagner was convicted of murder and conspiracy. The judge, recognizing the cold, calculated nature of the crime, handed down the ultimate sentence for a non-capital case. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Shane Lovin also received a life sentence. Crystal Wagner entered the Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution as a young woman. She is now middle-aged. She has watched her children grow up from a distance, through letters and occasional visits, knowing that she is the reason they don't have a father. She destroyed her own family for a romance that ended in a prison cell. Lee Wagner is buried, his life cut short by the person he trusted most. Crystal Wagner remains behind bars, a permanent resident of the South Carolina prison system. She wanted a new life? She got one. But instead of a honeymoon with her lover, it's a life of waking up every single day in a 6x8 cell, knowing she will never walk free again. Case 6. The Columbia Anti-Abuse. Columbia, South Carolina, the state capital. It is a city known for its blistering heat, its university spirit, and its deep history. But in the shadows of the city's residential neighborhoods, there are children who fall through the cracks of the system, entrusted to family members who turn out to be monsters in disguise. 3-year-old Ariel Morgan was a child who needed a safe harbor. Her biological mother was unable to care for her, so the family made a decision that happens thousands of times a day in America. They placed her with a relative. They gave her to her aunt, LaDasha Harrell. LaDasha was supposed to be the good option. She was supposed to be the protector. She was supposed to be auntie. But inside LaDasha's home in Richland County, the title of auntie was a cruel joke. To Ariel, LaDasha was a tormentor. The arrangement began with hope, but it quickly descended into a nightmare of discipline gone wrong. Ladasha Harrell was a woman with a short fuse and a belief in brutal corporal punishment. She viewed the normal behaviors of a toddler, accidents, crying, messiness, as acts of defiance that needed to be beaten out of the child. The abuse was systemic. It wasn't a one-time loss of control. It was a daily regime of terror. Ladasha used a belt as her primary weapon. She whipped the 3-year-old for wetting the bed. She whipped her for eating too slowly. She whipped her for simply existing in a way that annoyed her. The tragedy reached its crescendo in the summer of 2011. On the day Ariel died, she had committed the crime of having a potty training accident. For a 3-year-old, this is normal. For Ladasha Harrell, it was a capital offense. Ladasha flew into a rage. She grabbed the belt. She beat the child so severely that Ariel's body simply couldn't withstand the trauma. The autopsy would later reveal that Ariel had been struck with such force that her little body was covered in welts, bruises, and lacerations. She had been beaten from her shoulders to her legs. When Ariel collapsed and stopped breathing, the panic set in. Not panic for the child, but panic for herself. Ladasha called 911, but the story she told was the classic lie of the abuser. She claimed Ariel had fallen. She claimed she had choked. She tried to explain away the catastrophic injuries that covered her niece's body. Paramedics arrived at the home and were immediately suspicious. They rushed Ariel to Palmetto Health Richland Hospital, but it was too late. The doctors pronounced her dead, but they also pronounced it a homicide before the police even arrived. You don't get those kinds of injuries from a fall. You get them from a beating. The investigation was swift. Ladasha Harrell was arrested and charged with homicide by child abuse. In the interrogation room, Ladasha tried to justify her actions. She claimed she was just disciplining the child. She invoked the Bible. She invoked old-school parenting. But the detective showed her the photos. They showed her the belt. There is no discipline in the world that justifies rupturing a child's internal organs. That isn't parenting. The trial in 2012 was a grim affair. The jury was forced to look at the evidence of what happens when an adult unleashed their full fury on a toddler. The prosecutor called Ladasha a monster who had betrayed the ultimate trust of her family. The jury agreed. Ladasha Harrell was found guilty. The judge, looking at a woman who had taken a family member's child and returned a corpse, showed no mercy. He sentenced Ladasha Harrell to life in prison. Ladasha Harrell is currently incarcerated in the South Carolina Department of Corrections. She will never again have the power to hurt a child. She will never again hold a belt in anger. She sits in her cell, a woman who thought she could beat obedience into a child, only to find that the only thing she earned was a lifetime of captivity. Ariel Morgan is gone, a 3-year-old who never made it to kindergarten. But her story is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous place for a child isn't with a stranger, but with the family members we assume are safe. Case 7. The Greenville Search History. Greenville, South Carolina, May 2022. The upstate of South Carolina is booming. Greenville has transformed from a quiet textile town into one of the trendiest cities in the South, known for its beautiful downtown waterfall and thriving economy. But just minutes from the high-end restaurants and tourist spots, 5-year-old Ariel Robinson was living a life of hidden torment. He was a kindergartner, a boy who should have been learning his ABCs and playing on the playground. Instead, he was fighting for survival in his own home. Ashley Henderson, his mother, was the person responsible for that survival. But in the spring of 2022, she failed him in every conceivable way. The tragedy came to light on a Sunday, May 22. Ashley Henderson called 911. Her voice was panicked as she reported that her son, Ariel, was unresponsive. She claimed he had fallen a few days prior, maybe from a slide or while playing, and had just suddenly taken a turn for the worse. When paramedics arrived at the apartment, they found Aurelie lifeless. They rushed him to the hospital, but the doctors in the ER saw immediately that this was no playground accident. Aurelie was a roadmap of trauma. The medical examiner later determined that the 5-year-old had died from blunt force trauma to the head and trunk. The injuries were fresh, and they were catastrophic. But the most chilling part of the investigation wasn't just the physical abuse. It was what Ashley Henderson did. Detectives seized her phone. In the modern age, a smartphone is often the best witness to a crime. It tells us what a person was thinking when no one was watching. And Ashley Henderson's search history was a confession written in digital code. In the hours and days leading up to Aurelie's death, when he was clearly suffering, likely seizing or vomiting from the brain injury, Ashley didn't call 911. She didn't drive him to the ER. Instead, she went to Google. She searched for terms like how to treat a concussion at home, signs of a seizure, how to help a child who won't wake up. She was trying to play doctor because she was terrified of playing the suspect. She knew that if she took him to the hospital, the doctors would see the bruises. They would ask questions she couldn't answer. So, she chose to let him suffer, while she scrolled through medical websites, looking for a home remedy for murder. The delay was fatal. Medical experts testified that if she had called 911 immediately after the injury, Aurelie might have had a chance. Surgery could have relieved the pressure. He could have lived. But Ashley Henderson waited until he was dead before she decided to be a concerned mother. The trial in Greenville County was emotional. The jury saw the pictures of a beautiful 5-year-old boy whose life was extinguished by the woman who gave birth to him. They saw the search history, the cold, calculated decision to prioritize her freedom over his life. In 2024, justice finally arrived. Ashley Henderson was found guilty by child abuse. The judge sentenced her to 30 years in prison. It is a sentence that ensures Aurelie's memory will outlive his mother's freedom. Ashley Henderson will sit in a cell for the next 3 decades, with nothing to do but think about that Google search history. She looked for answers on the internet, but the only answer she found was a prison sentence. Case 8. The fentanyl bottle. Chester, South Carolina. October 2021. Chester County sits quietly between the bustling metros of Charlotte and Columbia. It is a rural landscape of pine forests and small-town struggles where the opioid epidemic has seeped into the soil like a toxic chemical. For years, the headlines about fentanyl were statistics, faceless numbers on a government report. But in the fall of 2021, the crisis found a face. It was the face of an 11-month-old baby, and the woman who put the poison in his hands was his own mother. 33-year-old Joyce Stover. Joyce Stover was a woman who had already lost the privilege of unsupervised motherhood. The South Carolina Department of Social Services, DSS, had intervened in her life previously. They saw the red flags. They saw the instability. As a result, Joyce was allowed to visit her infant son, but she was never supposed to be left alone with him. The system had built a wall to protect the child. But on the 30th of October 2021, that wall was breached by negligence. The infant was staying at his grandmother's house on Elizabeth Drive. It was supposed to be a safe haven. But on that fatal afternoon, the grandmother left the house to run errands, leaving Joyce Stover alone with the baby. It was a violation of the safety plan, a momentary lapse in judgment that would have permanent consequences. What happened inside that house during the grandmother's absence is a chilling example of the new wave of maternal evil, not necessarily a violent rage, but a lethal apathy. Joyce Stover was an addict. She brought her demons with her in her pocket. She had fentanyl. When the grandmother returned, she walked into a scene of silent horror. She found Joyce Stover passed out, asleep in a narcotic stupor, and on the kitchen floor, she found the baby. He wasn't playing. He wasn't crying. He was limp. The panic that followed was chaotic. The baby was moved to a crib. First responders were called. They found a bottle of naloxone, Narcan, in the crib, evidence that someone knew exactly what had happened and had tried, too little and too late, to reverse the overdose. The baby was pronounced dead. The cause? Acute fentanyl toxicity. The investigation by the Chester County Sheriff's Office was surgical. They didn't just accept this as an accidental exposure. They treated it as a homicide. They looked at the toxicology reports. They looked at the violation of the DSS order. They looked at the mother who chose to get high while she was the sole guardian of a helpless infant. Prosecutors argued that this wasn't just an accident. It was homicide by child abuse. In South Carolina law, this charge applies when a parent shows extreme indifference to human life. Bringing an open stash of fentanyl into a room with a crawling baby is the definition of extreme indifference. It is like placing a loaded gun in a crib and hoping it doesn't go off. Joyce Stover stood trial in 2023. She tried to deflect. She tried to minimize her role. But the jury looked at the photos of the 11-month-old. The verdict was guilty. Circuit Court Judge Brian Gibbons did not hold back. He looked at the destruction caused by fentanyl, and he looked at the mother who brought it to her son's lips. He sentenced Joyce Stover to 35 years in prison. In October 2025, the South Carolina Court of Appeals upheld her conviction, cementing her fate. Joyce Stover will not walk free until she is nearly 70 years old. She sits in prison today, a symbol of the epidemic that is killing America's children, not from the streets, but from the very parents who are supposed to be their shield. Case 9. The Food Network Killer. Simpsonville, South Carolina. January 2021. In the age of social media, we are often guilty of believing the curated lives we see on our screens. We see the smiles, the hashtags, the carefully edited videos, and we assume we are looking at happiness. Ariel Robinson was a master of this digital deception. To the world, she was a charismatic, larger-than-life personality. She was a middle school teacher, a budding comedian, and a reality TV star who had won season 20 of the Food Network's hit show, Worst Cooks in America. She marketed herself as a loving mother of 5, 3 biological sons and 3 foster children she had recently adopted. She posted photos of her complete family on Instagram, using hashtags like Black Girl Magic and Adoption Journey. She was the face of a successful, loving, multiracial family in the quiet suburb of Simpsonville. But when the cameras stopped rolling and the Instagram filters were turned off, the Robinson home was not a sanctuary. It was a prison. The victim of this deception was 3-year-old Victoria Rose Smith. Victoria was a little girl with a smile that could melt glaciers. She had entered the foster system looking for a forever home, and the system believed they had found the perfect placement with the Robinsons. They were wrong. The facade shattered on the afternoon of the 14th of January, 2021. Ariel Robinson called 911. Her voice, usually booming with laughter on TV, was frantic. She told the dispatcher that her daughter, Victoria, was unresponsive. She claimed the toddler had consumed a large amount of water and had gone limp, a phenomenon known as dry drowning, she suggested. It was a bizarre, medically sophisticated excuse, clearly designed to mislead. When paramedics arrived at the home on Selwood Circle, they found Victoria on the floor. She wasn't breathing. But what stopped the first responders cold was the condition of her body. These were the marks of a systematic, high-velocity beating. Victoria was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead. The medical examiner's report was a document of horrors. Victoria hadn't drowned. She had bled. Essentially, she had been beaten until her body went into shock and shut down. The investigation turned immediately to the celebrity mother. Ariel Robinson tried to maintain her innocence. She blamed Victoria's 7-year-old brother, claiming the children had been fighting. She blamed a clumsy fall. She used her skills as a teacher and a performer to try and spin a narrative of a tragic accident. But the police found the weapon. It wasn't water. It was a belt. The breakthrough came when Ariel's husband, Jerry Robinson, broke under questioning. He was arrested alongside her, and facing the prospect of life in prison, he decided to tell the truth. He described a scene that sounds like it belongs in a horror movie, not a suburban kitchen. He told investigators that on the morning of January 14th, Ariel had become enraged because Victoria had eaten pancakes too slowly. For the crime of eating breakfast at a toddler's pace, Ariel Robinson decided to inflict discipline. She grabbed a belt. But she didn't just strike the child. Jerry testified that he heard the thwack of the leather over and over again. He described Ariel beating the 3-year-old for nearly an hour. She beat her until the child collapsed. And here is the detail that reveals the true depth of the evil. Jerry Robinson testified that after the beating, Ariel Robinson sat down to eat her own lunch. The trial in Greenville County was a media sensation. The prosecution played the clips of Ariel on the Food Network, smiling and joking about her family, and then juxtaposed them with the autopsy photos of Victoria's body. They showed the jury the text messages where Ariel complained about the foster children, calling them demons and acting out. Ariel took the stand in her own defense, a risky move that backfired spectacularly. She tried to charm the jury. She tried to outsmart the prosecutor, but her arrogance shone through. She couldn't explain the bruises. She couldn't explain the timeline. She was exposed as a narcissist who cared more about her public image than the human life she had extinguished. In May 2022, the jury took less than 2 hours to return a verdict. Guilty of homicide by child abuse. Judge Letitia Verdon, who had presided over the grueling testimony, wasted no time. She looked at the woman who had used her fame to mask her cruelty, and she handed down the maximum sentence allowed by law: life in prison. Ariel Robinson, the woman who once stood in the confetti of a reality TV win, was led away in handcuffs. She will never cook on television again. She will never post another hashtag. She will die in the Leith Correctional Institution. Victoria Rose Smith was failed by the system that placed her there, but the justice system ensured her killer would never hurt another child. The Food Network killer is now just inmate 00385524, a woman who thought she could edit out a murder like a bad scene in a show, only to find that reality has no retakes. Case 10. The Myrtle Beach Disposal. Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, April 2015. The Grand Strand is 60 miles of sandy beaches, neon lights, and tourist attractions that draw millions of visitors every year. 1. It is a place of vacation memories, of families walking the boardwalk with ice cream, of laughter echoing off the Atlantic Ocean. But amidst the spring breakers and the families seeking escape, a horror unfolded that was so cold, so casual in its cruelty, that it stained the very reputation of the resort city. This wasn't a crime born of a sudden snap of rage or a long simmering domestic dispute. This was a crime of inconvenience. Gabriela Gonzalez was 26 years old. To the tourists passing her on the street, she was just another young woman navigating the crowds. But Gabriela was harboring a secret. She was pregnant, heavily pregnant. But unlike most expectant mothers who prepare nurseries and pick out names, Gabriela was preparing for an erasure. She didn't view the life inside her as a child. She viewed it as a problem to be solved. The events of the 16th of April 2015 were captured not by eyewitnesses, but by the silent, unblinking eyes of surveillance cameras, footage that would later become the most damning evidence in South Carolina history. Gabriela was staying at a condo complex, a typical vacation rental filled with families. On that quiet morning, she went into labor, but she didn't call an ambulance. She didn't wake a neighbor. She went into the bathroom of the condo and, alone, gave birth to a baby girl. The infant was healthy. She was alive. She took her first breath of air, but she found no comfort. What Gabriela Gonzalez did next defies every instinct of human survival. She didn't swaddle the baby. She didn't feed her. Instead, she treated the newborn like household refuse. She wrapped in a towel. Then, she placed her inside a black plastic. The surveillance cameras outside the condo complex captured Gabriela walking out the door. She looked calm. She wasn't running. She wasn't frantic. She was carrying the black bag with a casual indifference, swinging it slightly as she walked. She walked to the communal dumpster area, the place where vacationers threw away their pizza boxes and soda cans. She lifted the lid. She tossed the bag inside. And then, she walked away. The bag landed amongst the garbage. Inside, the baby girl was still alive, while her mother went back inside to resume her vacation. The discovery came hours later, but by then, it was too late. The baby had died of asphyxiation and exposure. When police were called to the scene, the seasoned officers of the Horry County Police Department were shaken. They had seen drug deals, assaults, and robberies, but finding a newborn baby discarded like a fast food wrapper was a level of evil they weren't prepared for. The investigation moved at lightning speed. In a tourist town, anonymity is usually easy, but the surveillance video was high definition. It showed Gabriela's face. It showed the bag. It connected the dots in a way she couldn't deny. When questioned, Gabriela's defense was baffling. She claimed she didn't know she was pregnant, a claim that medical evidence quickly debunked. She claimed the baby was stillborn, a lie that the autopsy destroyed. The medical examiner determined the child had been born alive. The community of Myrtle Beach, usually focused on tourism dollars, stopped in its tracks. A memorial sprang up near the dumpster. Strangers left teddy bears and flowers for baby Jane Doe, the girl who lived for only hours and knew only darkness. In 2016, Gabriela Gonzalez stood trial. She faced charges of homicide by child abuse. The prosecution played the surveillance tape. The jury watched in silence as the woman on screen walked to the dumpster, tossed the bag, and walked away without looking back. It was that lack of a backward glance that sealed her fate. It showed a total absence of humanity. Gabriela pleaded guilty. The judge, clearly struggling to comprehend the callousness of the act, sentenced her to 18 years in prison. While it was not a life sentence in name, for a young woman, it was a lifetime. Gabriela Gonzalez entered the prison system as a pariah. In prison, crimes against children are unforgivable. Gabriela is now in her mid-32s, still sitting in a cell in the Leith Correctional Institution. She threw her daughter away to maintain her lifestyle, to avoid the burden of motherhood. Instead, she traded that burden for the heavy chains of the South Carolina penal system. She walks the prison yard now, but in the minds of everyone who saw that tape, she will always be the woman walking toward the dumpster, carrying a secret she thought she could bury in the trash. From the murky depths of John D. Long Lake to the neon shadows of Myrtle Beach, we have traversed a landscape of unimaginable betrayal. These 10 cases, Susan Smith, Kimberly Martines, Shaquan Dooley, Zinzi Clemens, Crystal Wagner, Ladasha Harrell, Ashley Henderson, Joyce Stover, Ariel Robinson, and Gabriela Gonzalez reveal a terrifying truth about the human condition. We want to believe that motherhood is a sacred, unbreakable bond. We want to believe that the instinct to protect a child is wired into our DNA. But these women prove that evil can sever even the deepest biological ties. They killed for boyfriends, for insurance money, for attention, or simply for convenience. They looked into the faces of the most vulnerable human beings on earth, their own children, and chose death. But let us not remember them as powerful. In the end, they were stripped of their power by the gavel of South Carolina justice. They are no longer influencers, wives, or mothers. They are inmates. They are numbers in a ledger. They will grow old within the concrete walls of Leith and Graham, listening to the clock tick away the years they stole from their victims. We tell their stories, not to give them fame, but to give their victims a voice. Michael and Alex Smith, Peyton Martines, Devine and Jarvan Dooley, Jamea Green, Lee Wagner, Ariel Morgan, Aurelie Dobson, the baby of Chester County, Victoria Rose Smith, baby Jane Doe. These are the names that matter. These are the spirits that haunt the Palmetto State, reminding us that while evil may walk among us, justice, cold, hard, and final, is always waiting to answer.